One man's death in 1535 changed democracy forever, and nobody saw it coming. Thomas More walked to his execution that July morning for refusing to acknowledge King Henry VIII's supremacy over the Church. But his final words would expose a flaw in power that governments still struggle to fix today. The loophole he created has been exploited by leaders, activists, and revolutionaries for nearly 5 centuries. Henry VIII faced an unprecedented problem. More wouldn't agree with the king's divorce and religious reforms, but he also wouldn't speak against them. English law required proof of treason through spoken or written words. More remained silent. The king needed More's approval as England's most respected legal mind and former Lord Chancellor, but More understood something crucial about power. Silence could not be prosecuted as treason. The king's advisors scrambled to find a legal method to force More's hand. Unable to break More's silence legally, Richard Rich, the Solicitor General, committed perjury. Rich testified that More had privately denied the king's supremacy during a conversation. More called it a lie, but the court accepted Rich's testimony. The trial proceeded on fabricated evidence. More was convicted and sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled, but More had already planted the seeds of something far more dangerous than his own survival. Standing on the scaffold, More finally spoke. He declared himself the king's good servant, but God's first. Those words crystallized a principle that would haunt authoritarian rulers for centuries. More established that individual conscience could supersede state authority. The crowd witnessed something revolutionary masked as religious devotion. More had used his execution platform to broadcast a message the king couldn't silence. Dead men's words carry weight that living dissidents rarely achieve. More's execution created what political scientists now call the Martyr's Paradox. Silencing a dissenter through execution amplifies their message instead of eliminating it. Henry VIII wanted to end More's opposition, but the execution transformed More into a symbol of resistance. The loophole works because death removes the possibility of compromise, corruption, or recantation. The executed person's final position becomes permanent and unassailable. Their words become sacred, their cause becomes pure, and their followers become emboldened. Democratic systems proved especially vulnerable to this loophole. Democracies claim legitimacy through popular consent and moral authority. Executing or imprisoning peaceful dissenters undermines both claims. More's precedent showed that governments face a lose-lose scenario: tolerate dissent and appear weak, or suppress it and create martyrs. The loophole exploits democracy's foundational promise that individual rights matter. Authoritarian regimes can ignore martyrs, but democracies must respond to the moral questions they raise. History repeatedly confirmed More's accidental discovery. Socrates' execution strengthened philosophy's independence from the state. Joan of Arc's burning created French nationalism. John Brown's hanging accelerated the American Civil War. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. understood this loophole instinctively. Both leaders accepted imprisonment and death threats because they knew persecution would validate their movements. The British Empire and American segregationists fell into the same trap Henry VIII created. Violence against peaceful protesters generated more opposition than the protests themselves. Contemporary movements have weaponized More's loophole with precision. Hunger strikers, self-immolators, and imprisoned dissidents use their suffering to expose government cruelty. Digital media amplifies the effect exponentially. A single execution or imprisonment now reaches billions instantly. Governments struggle to respond. China's handling of Tiananmen Square protesters, Russia's treatment of opposition figures, and Iran's crackdown on demonstrators all demonstrate the loophole's enduring power. Each act of suppression generates international condemnation and domestic resistance. Modern governments developed counter-tactics to neutralize the martyr loophole. Character assassination precedes prosecution. Dissidents disappear without public trials. Accusations of corruption or sexual misconduct muddy moral clarity. Surveillance and social credit systems punish dissent before it reaches martyrdom-level visibility. These methods attempt to prevent the clean narrative that More's execution provided. The strategy works when governments control information flow, but fails when independent media exists. The loophole remains most powerful in partially free societies where people can still witness and share stories of persecution. Nearly 5 centuries after More's death, no government has solved the paradox he exposed. Democratic systems still cannot effectively suppress principled dissent without undermining their own legitimacy. The loophole persists because it exploits a fundamental human instinct. We admire those who sacrifice for their beliefs. More didn't plan to create a weapon against tyranny. He simply refused to compromise his conscience. But his execution revealed that power has limits even absolute monarchs cannot overcome. The willingness to die for an idea remains more powerful than the ability to kill for control. Thomas More's execution accidentally exposed democracy's greatest vulnerability and its strongest defense. Governments that respect individual conscience appear weak but remain stable. Those that crush dissent appear strong but create the seeds of their own destruction. The loophole remains open because closing it requires abandoning the principles that make democracy worth defending. Subscribe to explore more hidden moments that changed history forever.